Hey, friends, welcome back to another episode of Theology in the Raw. Our Sexuality and Gender Conference is right around the corner, September 17th to 18th in Austin, Texas at Life Family Church. You can sign up for the conference at centerforfaith.com. Also, right around the corner from that corner is our two-day Exiles of Babylon conference in Denver, Colorado, October 4th to 5th. You could register for that conference at theologyintheraw.com. My guest today is Phil Illy, who is the author of Autoheterosexual, Attracted to Being the Other Sex, a book that explains the science of internalized heterosexuality so that autogynephilic males and autoandrophilic females can better understand themselves and be more informed when contemplating gender transition. This is planned to be part of a two-part podcast series on the concept of autogynephilia. Phil, my first guest today, is not a Christian, so we're not having a question. We're not having a conversation surrounding the morality of autogynephilia. We are first trying to understand the concept. Phil is autogynephilic. This is his personal experience, and he's very well studied on the topic. His book is very long, very well researched around a very controversial issue. I'm planning to have another podcast with a Christian who also experiences autogynephilia or AGP, and in that conversation, we will look at it through a Christian lens. So I've probably used a lot of terms that maybe you're not familiar with. So just a very, very brief introduction to autogynephilia. The term was coined by psychologist Ray Blanchard first in 1989, and then through a series of articles, he teased out this concept. The term autogynephilia simply means the love of oneself as a woman, and Blanchard expands on this definition and says that autogynephilia is a male's propensity to be sexually aroused by the thought of himself as a female. That comes from an article in 1989 that Ray Blanchard wrote. There's been several books on this topic. In fact, this one right here is by Anne Lawrence, Men Trapped in Men's Bodies, Narratives of Autogynephilic Transsexualism. Dr. Anne Lawrence is a researcher who is also autogynephilic. And then this one is fairly popular, at least it was popular when it was written, J. Michael Bailey's The Man Who Would Be Queen. If you want a popular kind of introduction to the concept, I would probably recommend Bailey's. And then if you want a more academic, very thorough researched book, then I would recommend Anne Lawrence's book. And I would recommend Phil's book as well. This is very controversial, this topic. In fact, some people have accused me of, promoting junk pseudoscience by even mentioning the concept of autogynephilia, which I've done just briefly in my book Embodied. But I just think that's just not true. The concept obviously exists because I have several people in my life that experience this. Phil, our guest for the show, experiences it, and Lawrence surveyed over 200 people in her research that experience AGP. And as you'll hear in this podcast, there's actually a good percentage of natal males who might identify as trans that we would experience some level of AGP. So that's what we're doing in this podcast episode. Again, controversy is the name of the day, but I found Phil to be a very thoughtful, well-researched person and who brings his own story to the table. So welcome to Theology Raw, folks, and welcome to the show for the first time, the one and only Phil Illy. All right, greetings, Phil. Welcome to Theology Raw. Thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Preston.
So we've known each other for about 9 seconds, so my audience can listen in as we get to know each other. So tell us, a bit about yourself, and then I would love to get into autogynephilia and have you help us understand what it is, what it isn't, and then we'll see where that goes.
Yeah. I reached out to you because an autogynephilic person I know that I met through the internet said they heard about it through your book, and I checked out how you wrote about it in
Mm,
embodiment,
mm,
and I was really impressed with how few words you conveyed the gist of it in a really
mm,
clear, non-stigmatizing and
mm.
understanding way. And so that's why I reached out to you. And
Yeah.
um, I learned that I had this sort of internalized heterosexuality. It's called autogynephilia,
Mhm,
um, and it means love of self as a woman. And I learned I had this at about age 31, so 5 or 6 years ago, and it kind of blew my mind that I had been dealing with this for years privately, and no one told me about it. It's like why wasn't I told about this? And,
mm,
and I, it bothered me that other people were going through similar experiences. So I wrote a book that explains autogynephilia and also
mm,
its counterpart in females, autoandrophilia.
mm,
Um, the book's called Autoheterosexual. The idea being that it's just heterosexuality turned inward towards the self.
mm.
And yeah, I took a few years to write that. I tried to distill what the research said into a very easy read so that the people who had this could be like, oh, that's what's going on with me, and then not
Mhm.
not necessarily feel as ashamed about it and feel that they finally like sort of get what's going on.
How would you, just for our audience, and I might start really 101 just to make sure. I mean, some of my audience is going to be very well educated. Some are going to be like nothing, coming in. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, like, um, how is autogynephilia different from maybe a different kind of gender dysphoria or trans experience that probably most people are more familiar with?
Well, at least in natal males, people that are born male, autogynephilia is the most common kind of trans experience. It's at least 80% in Western individualistic countries of people transitioning male to female are of autogynephilic etiology.
Wow.
The other type is the homosexual type, in which um, it seems that sexual orientation develops alongside a bunch of other psychological traits, perhaps in utero. And so when someone basically homosexuals can sometimes be very gender nonconforming, and this is just sort of like an
Mm,
inborn thing. They sort of have a cross gender shift in personality traits, and sometimes this is to a degree that makes them feel uncomfortable socially as living as their birth sex, and they may transition to become socially heterosexual and sort of slot into society better. So yeah, that's the other type.
okay. What are some characteristics of, if somebody experiences autogynephilia, maybe even somebody listening saying, huh, I think I might experience some of this stuff. What are some key characteristics that would describe somebody who has AGP? And we say, so AGP is kind of the shortened the acronym, or yeah, this
Right.
acronym
Yeah.
for autogynephilia.
Um. I guess like in a sexual context, it would be say like during fantasies being a woman, and this could include being a woman, being intimate with men. Um. Um. If they've ever say cross-dressed and that led to sexual arousal,
Mm,
that is from autogynephilia. And yeah, basically if they find that being feminine or thinking of themselves as a woman improves their sexual experience or sexual
mm,
gratification, then autogynephilia is the likely reason for that.
mm,
And outside of just a sexual context, I'd mention that first just because the concept is ultimately about a sexuality, but it manifests in other ways too, just in everyday cognition, where someone that's autogynephilic might see a beautiful woman and feel this inner conflict about not knowing whether they want to be with her or be her. It's this
mm,
sort of like tension between this gender envy and attraction. and it can be very confusing. That's one sign just in everyday life, where if they see women and envy them and want to be in their place
Mm-hmm.
and feel sort of a sad longing that they're not
Mm-hmm.
female. And yeah, if someone has gender dysphoria that first arose after puberty and
Ah.
gets worse with time, then that is likely the autogynephilic type of gender dysphoria as well.
So the non-autogynephilic type, typically they might have. So if somebody has early onset gender dysphoria, it's like from the time they're 2, 3, 4, 5 years
Yeah,
old, they've
that's the
had gender.
homosexual kind.
I didn't know that. So AGP is a post or late onset post puberty. Okay.
Yeah,
I
because yeah, it's sort of like when most people go through puberty and their sex drive ramps up. They sort of
mhm,
start having infatuations and strong attractions, and when that happens with an internalized form of sexuality, it'll make them want to start being whatever it is they're attracted to.
okay. Okay. I've also heard it described. I don't. I've got a couple books in front of me, and we can maybe get to these later. But would love your thoughts on Bailey's book that kind of put this on the map.
Yeah, it's a good intro to it. Only the last third of the book really handles
Okay.
autogynephilia, though. It's mostly about the homosexual type because that was more of
Okay.
his research program at the time was male
Right.
homosexuality.
This one I found it's more academic, but really thorough and
Yeah,
helpful. Is that? I mean,
it.
because Anne Lawrence is also autogynephilic researcher.
Hmm.
Um. So, and then I've read
Yeah,
other stuff by more articles and stuff, but another description I think that came, I think it might have been Bailey said like socially speaking, people with AGP would typically, natal males who would be more socially masculine. They, you know, athletic in the military. They're in male typical professions, computer science or something like that. These would be kind of other indicators. Have you found that to be true as well? Is that, first of all, is that an accurate? I'm recalling from like 5 years ago when I read up on this.
yeah. I think that's it. Typically, males that are autogynephilic are kind of normatively masculine for their sex.
Mhm.
They might be a little some of them, particularly the autistic ones, might be a little kind of like shy and introverted, or
Okay.
not really settled into masculinity quite strongly, but it, they do seem on average normatively masculine. And some of them, as part of trying to fight this sort of like inner woman within them,
Mhm.
some of them sort of double down on masculinity in their 20s, say like by
Mm.
trying to enlist in the military, or getting really into weightlifting or martial arts, or something very masculine to try to have their male side win the inner conflict.
Interesting. Was that your experience, or tell us about your own
I
journey in this?
I mean, I did have a phase of having that inner conflict, and it's hard to say how much of my working out and getting strong was to try to win over the inner female self, but
Hmm.
I I did have a phase of having that inner conflict in my mid
Mm.
20s for a few years. Um, and then it sort of receded for a bit, because probably because I got into relationships. Often with autogynephilia, when you get into a relationship with a woman, in the first sort of in the honeymoon period, the autogynephilia can sort of recede,
Mm.
as sort of your attraction to women is being satiated by the real live woman that you're with.
Okay.
But once the honeymoon phase ends, often the autogynephilia comes back.
Hmm. I've
And
had one friend describe it to me as exactly what you said. That's almost to the T what he said. And then over time, it's almost like he would struggle with almost being like jealous of his wife, or like envious
yeah,
of her,
the
and
gender
would feel,
envy. Yeah,
yeah, and would feel so guilty. It's like my wife. I love her. I value her, and for some reason I have these hard to pin down like uh thoughts of her, but not like a desire for her objectively, but yeah, almost like a jealousy. Um,
right. Yeah, that happens a lot, and often with autogynephilia, someone can kind of it'll have tendency to make them put women on a pedestal and like really admire them deeply. And that can also make the feelings of envy even more bad.
Wow. You said something that I'm pretty sure is very controversial. I would love for you to dig into a bit. That you said about 80 that most trans women, so natal males who identify as women, maybe transition, about 80%. You're saying are autogynephilic? Because I was literally I just read. I googled. Well, I'm not going to set there's not. I won't give you the backstory here, but on a Reddit thread that discusses me, they discredit my work because they said I talk about autogynephilia, which has been largely discredited as an actual phenomena. So this person says my work is junk because I mentioned autogynephilia when this has just been largely discredited. It doesn't even exist. And you're saying the opposite. Not only does it exist, it's your story, so you exist. But 80% is that well
Yeah.
established? Is that a controversial number? Where are you getting that from?
So the way that calculation is done is so Ray Blanchard, who coined the concept of autogynephilia and worked at a gender clinic from 1980 to 1995, he found that he separated male to female transsexuals according to sexual orientation into homosexual, bisexual, asexual, and heterosexual groups to see sort of which groups seem to be similar and which seem to be different. He was trying to figure out how many types of trans there were, and he found that all the homosexual ones were different from what he called the non-homosexual ones. Non-homosexual meaning either bisexual, asexual, or heterosexual with respect to birth sex. And the ones who were non-homosexual, the majority of them, the vast majority of them, reported that they had been aroused by cross-dressing before, or that they had been aroused by fantasies of being a woman. Whereas in the homosexual group, a much smaller proportion, in his research, 15%, said that they had been aroused by cross-dressing before. So, I guess, the homosexual group, 15% of them reported prior arousal from cross-dressing, and then the non-homosexuals altogether, 73% of them said that they had been aroused by cross-dressing. So there's just these huge statistical differences there. And what it pointed to is that there's sort of an erotic anomaly that the non-homosexual ones were oriented towards the idea of being a woman. And they were also different from the homosexual group in terms of the age they presented at the clinic and their sort of recalled childhood gender nonconformity. But yeah, basically Ray Blanchard found that you could, based on this, you could sort of diagnostically determine that, like, if a person born male is experiencing gender dysphoria and they were heterosexual, bisexual, or asexual with respect to birth sex, that they have the autogynephilic type of gender dysphoria. And so the 80% figure, I calculated that by just looking at the very large transgender surveys in the United States, like the 2011 National Transgender Discrimination Survey and the 2015 U.S. Transgender Survey. They had thousands and thousands of participants. So just there's a huge N, and I thought, and this data set is used by tons of conventionally mainstream trans researchers. So I figured I'll use the same data set if they're signaling that it's valid. And I just added up based on the reported sexual orientation identities, whether people said they were straight or bisexual or whatever. I added up all the ones that indicated non-homosexuality, and that sort of gets you, that's where the 80% figure comes from.
Okay. Pretty thought out. You're not just throwing it around. So most people that experience AGP let me ask you a question. Do most people of the 80%, would they say that this is their experience?
No. No, they would strongly deny it. So, with similar verbiage to what you mentioned when you said someone on Reddit was trying to discredit your work. They'll often talk about autogynephilia as if it's been debunked or that it's pseudoscience or that it's
Mm.
transphobic or it was just basically made by this transphobic
Right.
psychologist for the purpose of stigmatizing trans women. And it's because the theory is true that there is such strong opposition to it. Because
Mm.
it's because they're so deeply attached to the feminine persona within them, and it hurts to have that questioned.
Mm.
Almost like if you were to say like insult a man's wife, but it's even more personal because it's within them.
Wow.
And so they have really strong opposition to the theory, and it's because it's true. But they can't admit that to themselves. But
Mm.
that's the situation.
How about with your story? When you said you just 5 years ago, well, you've had the experience since puberty, but 5 years ago you were introduced to the category. Did you find it stigmatizing, or why are you different? Why are you freely able to, talk about it?
Um, I prioritize truth very highly. If something is true, then that's like enough said, case closed. It the truth if it's true, it's true. And I and also physically I have a pretty masculine skeleton and there's no amount of hormones or
Mhm.
surgeries that could ever make me reasonably approximate a female like appearance. And so I knew that transitioning probably wasn't in the cards for me. And so I probably wouldn't develop the same degree of attachment to that feminine self as other people who say could transition. And so
Mhm.
I I decided to speak about this just because it it really bothered me that if at, there's like a few percent of males that have this, which means millions in just the US alone.
Mhm.
And th- there's just so many people out there that privately deal with these feelings either
Mhm.
constantly or just intermittently, and it bothers them and it confuses them. And it seems that it'd be better if they could instead encounter the concept and be like, recognize themselves in it, and then be like, oh, that's what it is. Okay, you know, and
Mhm.
like I think it could be a lot simpler.
Mhm. When you look around at, and this, I don't know if there's a definitive answer to this, but in just in your opinion or perception, when you look at kind of like trans women in pop culture, do you would your guess be like most of them would be autogynephiliac, or
Yeah, it's just because statistically that is the vast majority.
that's true, yeah.
There's a few. It's really what's more interesting is to trying to find which ones are the other type, the homosexual type, because
Mhm.
based on the different base rate percentages, it's kind of safe to like if you're just trying to guess, you kind of can assume autogynephilic unless until proven
Mhm.
otherwise, and
Mhm.
you'll be right much of the time.
Mhm.
And so yeah, like someone like Caitlyn Jenner, for instance, who transitioned late in life and had been married to multiple women, that's someone that fits the autogynephilic profile.
Right.
Um,
Very masculine
and
Olympian, like, yeah.
mhm,
Yeah,
exactly.
and in my experience too, and again, I'm only basing this on a few people that I personally know, the books that I read, and so on. People that I suspect might be AGP, if they do transition, they their female presentation. I want to say it in a way that's not maybe like is much more sensual, is much more stereotypical female. And yeah, maybe sensual is the best. I mean, the classic example is Caitlyn Jenner on the cover of, what was it, Vanity Fair or whatever. There was just this much, just kind of more erotic presentation of female. Almost like the idea, like it's almost like, well, as one trans person I know who I think is AGP as well said, it's almost like the presentation of female is the object of the male gaze. It's like what men want women to look like. That's who they kind of how they present. Would that be Would that be a fair assumption, or how would
Y-
you? Yeah.
yeah, because it's it's sort of based on what the person finds attractive in women, right? Like if and so it'll be things that also signify femininity to a high degree. So, it might seem a bit extra, particularly early in transition if they've been bottling up the feelings a long time and then it's sort of like they're finally letting it out. It'll be
Mhm.
pretty extra, especially at first. Um, but yeah, it's based on their own conception of what is a woman and what they find attractive in women, and so they want that for themselves. And
Hmm.
so yeah, it can lead to sort of that manifestation as you're saying, like sensual, where
Mhm.
it's yeah, it's is appealing to the male gaze because that's what it's trying to be or what it just
Hmm.
is.
Hmm. So yeah, I can imagine how that it can be stigmatized. Like I get why people would not want to talk about it or even admit it, because once you kind of sexualize this experience, they can have a certain stigma around it. Have you, in your interaction with other people, I imagine you've probably encountered other people since you've been talking and writing publicly about this that have talked to you about their own experience. Is that been true as well, that they feel stigmatized by the experience,
Um,
or
I would
shame, or yeah.
I would say I disproportionately talk to the ones that already know they're autogynephilic and have accepted it, just
Okay.
because otherwise, how would they encounter me?
Right.
Um, and they're typically some of them do have concerns about, say, if this theory were more widely known, how it might impact trans women who are just trying to go about their lives. Um,
Okay.
in terms of societal discrimination, there is some concern about that, and reasonably so. Um, but I think the ones who already know that they're autogynephilic, they don't worry too much that it's could be seen as stigmatizing because they already accept that it's ultimately born out of sexuality.
Okay. Hmm. Okay. How many people have you met over the years that experience AGP?
Uh, it's hard to quantify. I mean, much of it is over the internet. Um,
Mhm.
although in person in my everyday life, I encounter people in my social circles who inwardly categorize as autogynephilic, and I've talked to some of them, and that's been confirmed. But most of them, I don't bring it up with.
Okay.
Um, if they've already transitioned, I
Okay.
don't talk to them about it. It's if people are much more open to it before they transition, hearing about it, but afterwards there's
Mhm.
tends to be resistance. So that's just something I found. But yeah,
Mhm.
many people over the internet, because I'm well plugged into the
Okay.
sort of a growing online community of people that know they have this orientation and want and like understanding themselves on a reality basis, and
Mhm.
because they care about what's true. And so
Hmm.
those are mostly the ones I talk to.
Have you faced a lot of opposition as well? Because
Sometimes, yeah. For the most part, the trans community is ignoring me for now because they don't want to talk about the subject. They they're going to ignore it as long as possible. Um, I have I I attended there was a sort of a GenSpect conference last fall. I don't know if you heard about them. They're an
yeah, yeah.
organization. Yeah,
Is that Sasha Ayad and Stella
it's
O'Malley? Those, or no?
well, Stella's the one that is the director
Okay.
of it.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, I attended that, and the conference went fine. But then a few days later on Twitter, um, someone started trying to initiate a struggle session against GenSpect because I had been there,
Mm.
and it led to this Twitter controversy.
Oh wow.
Um, and so yeah, so far there's only been one controversy, and it was started by feminists. So that's not really a
Mm.
big deal, I don't think.
Okay. You seem like you would handle it okay if you did face opposition.
Yeah, I mean, I have to. I was very scared of going down this path of being out about this because of
Okay.
what happens to people who talk about this.
Mhm.
But I realized that this is true, and it comes up generation after generation. It's not going away. And at a certain point,
Mhm.
we have to exist in the light of truth.
Mhm.
And someone, and preferably more than one person, a group of people need to start talking about it and saying, yeah, I have this, and humanizing it so that people who
Mhm.
have these feelings can know what's going on with them.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, nothing's helped. Nobody's helped by silencing the conversation. Of course, there's going to be maybe debated areas within the research. That's always going to be true, but we can't debate those areas unless we have the conversation. If you just shut down the conversation by labeling something, transphobic or pseudoscience or whatever, then that's just not helping anybody. I've talked to a few people who find great relief just knowing that there is a name for this.
Yeah.
When I speak on the topic, and if I do end up mentioning autogynephilia, which might be 20 seconds of my presentation, just kind of as one of many diverse trans experiences, um, I almost always get somebody that comes up with, I can just feel see the shame in their face, but also a ray of hope. Like, wait, what you were saying there, I feel like you were describing me. I get that a decent amount, and so, um, yeah, I think talking about it can potentially reduce the shame, which is a starting place that anybody needs to take. Um, uh, how so if somebody has AGP and they don't want to transition for whatever reason, what are some other ways to mitigate the dysphoria? You can even speak personally for you, or yeah.
Um, to to mitigate the dysphoria, it's about increasing the proportion of positive gender related experiences, which are sometimes called gender euphoria, and
Mm,
and reducing the amount of negative gender related experiences, gender dysphoria. And if to mitigate the dysphoria, you have to get in touch with that inner feminine construct to some degree, right? Because it arises out of sexual orientation, and people typically develop a bond with that feminine construct within themselves. And so they have to just fully trying to close off that part of themselves. Like full on repression seems to not lead to as good of well being as, say, like indulging in various ways. And that could either be, say, like sexually in the bedroom,
mm,
or altering how they dress, or change their gender presentation. Maybe they want a different haircut, or to
mm,
grow their hair out. Maybe they want to try makeup. Um, it the types of things that an autogynephilic person wants to embody, it it, it varies. Some of them care mostly about having a female body, or
mhm,
about being seen by others as female. And in those cases, something like transsexualism is kind of like the most realistic way of attaining that sort of desire.
mm,
Others wish to dress more like a woman or to behave like one.
mm,
And so the what we typically the sort of consensus among people that are autogynephilic, that know they're autogynephilic, and also that has been reported by old transvestite organizations such as the Society for the Second Self, is integration, where instead of fully repressing the female side, you allow it to express to some degree, but
mm,
you integrate it into your self system as two sides that are part of a whole, rather than
mm.
just completely closing one off.
This episode is brought to you by MitoPure by Timeline. Timeline is a Swiss-based life science company and is a global leader in urolithium A research. Okay, so I've recently been learning about urolithium A. Urolithium A is a powerful postbiotic that is nearly impossible to get just from your diet alone. And MitoPure is the first product to offer a precise dose of urolithium A to upgrade your mitochondrial function, increase cellular energy, and improve muscle strength and endurance. One way to think about MitoPure is that they are little like Pac-Men for you Gen Xers, Pac-Men in your cells, chomping up the damaged mitochondria that makes you feel old and tired and recycling it into new healthy ones. According to Timeline, taking 2 soft gels a day for 2 months results in significant improvements in your cellular energy, muscle strength, and endurance. After 4 months of taking MitoPure, you'll feel yourself getting stronger, recovering faster after a workout, and experiencing less inflammation. Now, Timeline is offering a 10% off discount of your first order of MitoPure. If you go to timeline.com/theology and use the code theology, you'll get 10% off your order. That's Timeline, timeline.com/theology to take advantage of this offer. Go check it out. Hey friends, I am so excited to let you know that the Upside Down Kingdom Study Bible releases on September 10th, and I had the absolute pleasure of serving as the general editor for the study notes for the study Bible. And we enlisted a fantastic team of scholars and writers and thinkers, people like Francis Chan, John and Lisa Bevere, Michael Bird, Eugene Cho, Derwin Gray, Michelle Knight, Rebecca McLaughlin, and the list goes on and on and on. The study notes address topics like creation care, divorce, festivals, food and drink, science, sexuality, gender, Satan, demons, angels and giants, politics, race and ethnicity, and many, many other relevant cultural, political, and social topics. So please check it out, the Upside Down Kingdom Study Bible, wherever books and Bibles are sold. What role might porn play in someone's experience? Is porn use a how do I well, so many people watch porn, so this isn't to like single out a group, but could porn exacerbate someone with AGP, their dysphoria, or is it just unrelated to
While it doesn't cause autogynephilia in the first place, it can intensify the erotic target identity. There's a technical, basically, it can intensify the dysphoria and the trans identity that can arise out of autogynephilia, even though it doesn't cause the autogynephilia in the first place.
Okay.
And depending on the type, basically, because through that porn, they can, if that's a way that they get in touch with that side of themselves, that autogynephilic side, it could severely conflict with their self-image, because quite a bit of the porn is degrading to various degrees. And if they incorporate that into their self-concept, it can, injure their self-image and ultimately make them feel worse about themselves over time. And so, using porn can exacerbate the identity and dysphoria aspects of it. And that's sort of just the gist of it. The theory of the broader theory that the concept of autogynephilia falls within is there's this theory called erotic target identity inversion theory, which is basically that sometimes sexual attractions get inverted inward towards the self, and it makes you get attracted to being whatever it is that you love. And when this happens with male heterosexuality, it creates autogynephilia. But when it happens with other sort of attractions, such as some men are attracted to amputees, for instance, and some of them have an internalized attraction to being an amputee, and it can make them want to have their limbs severed. You may have heard of body integrity dysphoria.
Yeah.
That's what this is caused by. It's the same root cause of internalized sexual
Interesting.
attraction, but it's for
Wow.
being a different type of thing.
Hmm.
And basically, the erotic target identity inversion theory separates between the internalized attraction and the dysphoria and identity crisis that can result from it. Um,
Hmm.
the the strength of the internalized attraction strongly correlates with the strength of dysphoria and sort of trans identity that result from it. But it's not necessarily a one-to-one connection, but it's very highly connected. And so someone that is someone that like goes real hard on expressing their autogynephilia to the fullest degree, like all the time, it's gonna lead to a much faster cross-gender development process in terms of coming to
Hmm.
identify as a woman than if they sort of indulge more occasionally in a more moderated manner.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, that's helpful. Um, do we know anything about the cause, the whole nature, nurture, biology, environment, or is it this? Like, I know with same sex sexuality, it's kind of like we can't really. It's just kind of a blend of nature, nurture. There's probably a lot of biological push. There's also some environmental factors. It's hard to kind of untangle it all. Is that similar for AGP, or do we know about the cause?
The heritability of autogynephilia has not been directly measured yet.
Okay.
However, the heritability of gender dysphoria or gender nonconformity has been measured, and it does seem heritable to some degree. The measurements vary widely, but they
Hmm.
always find some degree of heritability.
Okay.
Um, and I do think it does seem to be an inborn predisposition. The type of culture and environment someone is in will alter the particular ways in which it manifests, say like the styles of dress that will be attractive, or whether they can even act on it. Say like in more Eastern collectivist countries, people might not even have any time alone to cross dress if they're living in intergenerational housing. So
Mm-hmm.
um, in Western individualistic countries, it seems to develop faster and more often. The sort of like the identity and dysphoria aspects of it. However, um, autogynephilia has arisen across generations, and it arises across many cultures. Um, it it doesn't matter where you give a survey
Okay.
to any people in like sort of the civilized world. Some proportion of them are going to report arousal, like prior arousal from cross dressing or from fantasies of being a woman,
Hmm.
and so yeah, I think I consider it a mostly innate trait, that it's mostly just an inborn thing. And
Hmm.
Blanchard sort of theorized that there's some mechanism in the brain that directs one's sexual attractions outward versus
Mm.
inward. And for sometimes there's a developmental, like during development, there's sort of what he considered like a mislearning where for some reason it gets directed inward rather than outward.
Hmm.
And um, so that mechanism about whether attraction is directed inward rather than outward,
Mm.
it seems to be. I think that's primarily innate trait, like the
Okay.
degree to which one's sexual orientation is directed
Hmm.
inward, but it lots of life experiences will alter how the ways in which that manifests.
Do you know of any cases or many cases where somebody's AGP goes away through maybe efforts on their own, or just for no reason? It just kind of like they just don't deal with this anymore, or is it typically something people will experience on some level their whole life?
I would say typically it's always there, or the
Okay.
predisposition towards it is always there. Um, the most common way that people feel it going away and receding in intensity, like I mentioned, is when they get in a relationship with a woman and
Hmm.
temporarily their gynephilia is directed outwards rather than inwards.
Mm-hmm.
And I have read some first person reports from people that say they were able to steadily make it go away over time. And it's I think that there probably are people who can do that. And it doesn't mean like the predisposition is gone. Like if they were to allow themselves that sort of expression again, it would probably come roaring back.
Mm-hmm.
If they were to try cross dressing or something. But I do think there's some autogynephilic males whose autogynephilia is, say, like either similar in intensity to their externally directed gynephilia, or milder, where they can sort of route through conscious deliberate effort, route their attraction to women externally and dissuade themselves from that internal attraction.
Mm-hmm.
And it does seem that, yeah, like I said, some people have reported success doing this. It's
Mm-hmm.
hard to know though, because so much of the times when people report things, it's wishful thinking.
Yeah.
And as far as I can tell, the predisposition is largely innate. So
Yeah.
yeah, I'm not too optimistic, but some people have reported that they could change it and make it go away.
Okay. Yeah. Self-report's always tricky. You don't want to deny someone's self-report. At the same time, we're all humans, and self-report isn't always the most reliable. But what about does transitioning? If someone transitions, does that typically reduce or alleviate the dysphoria, or is it really case by case basis?
It So with autogynephilic gender transition, it seems to reduce dysphoria in a couple ways at the same time. One is that it reduces the one's sex drive, because by
Hmm.
taking anti-androgens and taking estrogen, a
Uh,
male will have a lower sex drive.
hmm.
Um, and on the other hand, it moves their body in the feminine direction. It alleviates sort of the emotional distress, because the way their body is changing is favorable to them. And
Hmm.
so it feels like a promising trajectory emotionally.
They're getting the body they desire,
Yeah,
whereas if they don't have that body, that desire is kind of unmet in a sense.
exactly. It helps meet the desire while also tamping down the desire in the first place. Um, and it, yeah, as far as I could tell, it medical transition in terms of taking hormones, at least for AGPs, there is a very high satisfaction rate. Some of them decide it's not for them. For example, some of them will go on, as soon as they go on the anti-androgens, all of a sudden they're- it'll eliminate their sex drive, and then they'll be like,
Hmm.
why am I even doing this? Why do I even want? They're not having the feelings of wanting to be a woman anymore, because the drugs alleviate it, and then they'll go off of it, and then the feelings come back, and some of them yo-yo back and forth quite a few
Huh.
times, because they don't understand the mechanism at play here. It's very confusing.
Huh.
Like, why being on testosterone would make you feel like you want to be more feminine, and being on estrogen would make you not want that anymore. It doesn't make
Yeah.
intuitive sense unless you understand autogynephilia.
So is our anti-androgens then, is that a potential, I don't say cure, but like a potential way to mitigate the dysphoria in somebody with AGP?
Just on their own, it's kind of my understanding. I'm not an endocrinologist, but
Yeah.
my understanding is that it's important to have at least one set of hormones in the body. Like, the human body is designed to either be
Right.
testosterone driven or estrogen driven,
Okay.
and being on neither, um, it,
Yeah.
it's not the best for the body. Like, it can lead to like osteoporosis and other various issues with health over time. So
Okay.
yeah.
You mentioned autoandrophilia, the love of oneself as a man, the opposite for natal females. In my limited reading compared to you, some say that isn't a thing, or it's extremely rare. Is that the case, or is it? Yeah.
I, I originally did believe that. Um, because scientists such as Michael Bailey and Anne Lawrence have said that
Okay.
because because autogynephilia is a paraphilia. If autoandrophilia existed, it would be a paraphilia, and females don't really get those, so
Mm.
it's unlikely that autoandrophilia exists. However, I did I changed my mind over time because while
Mm.
learning about autogynephilia, I encountered women online who said that they were autoandrophilic,
Mm. Wow.
and I set up Zoom calls with them to interview them about their experience, and what they said certainly seemed like if autoandrophilia existed, that this
Mm.
is it. And so I went through the sexology literature to try to find anything I could on it because they off usually male sexuality is studied by sexologists. They've historically neglected female sexuality. Um, but I was there's some cases of female transvestism
Mm.
where I read it and the psychology reported there the first person narrative, the quotes. It's very much like the analog of what autogynephilia is. Like the overall structure of thinking is the same, but it's about being a man instead. Um, and I also looked at research into trans men who are either bisexual or attracted to men because if autoandrophilia were to exist in females, you would expect it the ones the trans men who are attracted to men or
Mm-hmm.
who are bisexual to have
Right. Yeah.
autoandrophilia because they wouldn't be the homosexual type.
Right.
And what again, like those narratives that I saw, the overall structure of thinking is the same. I would say
Mm.
overall it's kind of like a female typical is more feminine with the overall cognition, maybe a little emotional and sentimental rather than
Mm-hmm.
directly sexual. But
Okay.
the overall structure of thinking was the same. And
Interesting.
since my book has come out, I've autoandrophiles had contact with autoandrophiles. I have a YouTube channel where I've interviewed a few.
Mm.
Um, and it does seem to be real. Again, to be clear, this is not yet accepted by sort of like the most prestigious sexologists yet. But there's the trans man population, the female to male population.
Mm-hmm.
Most of them do not report being just homosexual, like just attracted to females
Mm-hmm.
in terms of their sexual identities and in community samples. Most of them report a non-homosexual type of sexual identity,
Okay.
and so it means they're not the homosexual type, and so there's some other type, and the two contenders are either autoandrophilia or this or the rapid onset gender dysphoria that is
Right.
sometimes talked about.
Right.
I think for someone that has gone on testosterone and gotten a mastectomy and is pleased with it and is not homosexual, I think it's most likely that they're autoandrophilic. If they were to be pleased by those changes to their body, it doesn't seem like a simple matter of social contagion,
Mm-hmm.
especially if years later after doing it, they're still satisfied.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, I've originally did not think autoandrophilia was real, but then I looked into it and I concluded that yes, it is real, and that it's even harder for them to hear about it than it is for the autogynephilic people. So I
Mm.
included them in my book as equals because I wanted them to have a fair shot at hearing about their
Right.
orientation.
That's interesting. Wow. Yeah. I've not met somebody who would be characterized by that. So it's still way more rare than AGP for natal males, but definitely doesn't definitely exists. You've met people that fit the
Yeah, it's
description.
less
Yeah.
common. If I were to guess, just based on survey items, which is where people answer um, whether they're a man in their sexual fantasies or whether they've been aroused by such
Mm-hmm.
things. Um, if I were to guess, it's maybe like a half, maybe a third, somewhere between a third or a half is common as autogynephilia. And it there's a good chance that due to differences between the sexes in terms of their libido and just their sexual psychology, that it may it may not be as intractable of an attraction. Like for an autoandrophilic female, like she might be able
Mm-hmm.
to sort of put that to the side in favor of building a family and doing the more like conventional heterosexual things more easily than a male could.
Mm-hmm.
But this is just me speculating based on just
Yeah.
general feelings of differences in male female sexual
Yeah.
psychology.
It going back to autogynephilia. In your opinion, educated opinion, when we look out at, for instance, like drag queens are big in pop culture. We're coming off the Olympics, had some controversy around drag queens, and would you say that drag queens stereotypically fit an AGP persona?
Um, Historically, those were homosexuals, not
Okay,
not the AGPs, and
okay,
and drag queens were. It was something that was just done within the sort of like homosexual community, and it
right,
was generally hidden, and the general public did not see it. I think now that this stuff is more out in the open, that there are drag queens who are autogynephilic
okay,
now, but historically that identity and that subculture was just a
interesting. Okay,
homosexual thing.
okay. I mean, my understanding, I know even like drag queens can be so stigmatized, and I think people's knowledge is so politicized on just when they think of drag queens. Typically, like most people listening probably have never met somebody who's a drag queen. It's just kind of like those people out there. And depending on which news outlet you're reading this through, you're going to have a very different opinion on that population. But typically, like a drag queen is somebody who wouldn't even consider themselves trans. It's more of a performative thing that they do from time to time, not a sort of permanent identity. Now, again, there's going to be diversity within that population,
Right.
obviously.
But yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Um, but that like I don't want to. I'm not trying to correlate it, but it does seem similar. Somebody with AGP where cross dressing in private isn't a permanent thing. It's just something done periodically, like that. That seems to be similar to the drag queen experience. Um, but again, it could be two different things, though. I don't know.
Yeah, historically they were two different things where say maybe in the 70s or 80s before, back when this was much more stigmatized, the the cross dressers that dress in the privacy of their home
Mm-hmm.
would be they used to be called transvestites. They're
Right.
those were the autogynephiles, and
Mm-hmm.
the drag queens were homosexuals, and these
Okay.
communities
Interesting.
rarely intersected.
Okay.
I would say the only autogynephiles that would participate probably in that homosexual subculture were the ones that on a transsexual trajectory, where
Mm,
going to those places be a safe place for them to present in public.
mm,
Um, but generally, historically, they were separate populations because they are very psychologically different
mm,
conditions, and it's only now in the modern time where gender nonconformity and trans is sort of seen as this one thing,
mm-hmm.
that the different types are being mixed together in a much more fluid way.
Mm. I want to ask another question. This one's really sensitive. I mean, this whole conversation can be sensitive. People are like, "Wait, now you're getting sensitive." So I just want to word it as well as I can and be accurate. But I want to would love your opinion on because I think this might be where people's minds are going. Any kind of correlation between, like pedophilia and a kind of AGP experience. So let me be obviously, it should be obvious. I'm not correlating AGP with pedophilia, but pedophilia exists among all sexual orientations. My sexual orientation, heterosexual, got pedophiles in that, you know, population. So I'm going to assume that there's going to be some people with an AGP experience that also might experience some kind of pedophilia. Is that well, let me just throw it as a question. Is there any correlation here? Are these completely separate categories, or yeah.
So I don't know if there's there's a similarity in only in the very broad sense that these are atypical sexual attractions.
Mm-hmm.
You know, which places a sexuality under the heading of paraphilia, which means like beyond, like a beyond sort of love.
Okay.
But I don't think I've seen Blanchard tweet before that that in his experience at the clinic, he didn't see an overlap between autogynephilia and pedophilia.
Okay.
I mean, but that's just like, that's not like a study. That's just his like sort of opinion after just lots of experience. I would say though that if someone, when someone does have an internalized sexuality, it would be much easier to know if they are also pedophilic. For instance, like if they engaged in say like age regression or like wearing diapers, things like that, for either emotional or sexual gratification, that could be an indicator of sort of that they're attracted to youth. And when it's directed inward, it's particularly visible.
So it really is a separate category that, like anything, it could overlap, but we shouldn't in our minds think AGP is going to lead to or something like pedophilia.
Right. Yeah. I guess
that's important for people to hear, because that could be a good destigmatization of it, you know, so that people aren't making that connection.
I guess a clear way to say is that sexual orientation seems to be multidimensional. That there's like there's a dimension about gender and sex, and there's also one about age. That and these two have been established mathematically by research, that there's both a gender and an age dimension of sexual orientation. And it's also looking like that self-other dimension that I was talking about that leads to autogynephilia, that's another dimension, although it hasn't been conclusively proven yet, but that again seems to be another dimension. So basically sexual orientation, it has multiple dimensions to it. And the gender one, there's lots of ethical ways to act upon that. But if someone has an attraction to children, it's not ethical to act upon that. And so it's, while psychologically they may all fall under the idea of sexual orientation, in a moral and ethical sense, that they can't be equated.
Yeah, that's helpful. That's super helpful. Do you come across in your work, in your relationships, people you talk to, do you come across specifically Christians that experience AGP that reach out to you, and how do you navigate those conversations?
Some of them. That's how I heard about your work. And I do sometimes come across them. And in the subreddit where we have the self-aware autogynephiles, it's called Ask AGP for any Redditors listening to this. There are sometimes Christians that post about how they feel this tension between their autogynephilia and their desire to live their life in a way that fits with their religious aspirations. And so there's definitely a tension there, and there definitely are some Christian AGPs.
Do you have any religious background? I didn't ask you this at the beginning, because I know you're not a Christian, but I mean, were you at all raised in the church or
I
religious
was.
environment? Or?
My mom brought me to church for a few
Okay.
years because she thought that it was just part of being a parent was to like expose your kid to religion.
Yeah.
And then she asked me around. I think it was a Methodist church. There's some sort of ceremony that happens when you're around 8 years old. I don't know the name of it, but
Okay.
after that, she asked me if I wanted to keep going, and I said no, and that was
Okay.
it. But so yeah, I don't really have a deep religious
Yeah.
background. I recognize that it does help a lot of people live good, meaningful lives, and that it's important to a lot of people. But it hasn't yet appealed to me.
Yeah. Is there anything else? We're gonna wrap things up. Anything else that we haven't covered that you'd like our audience to know specifically about AGP?
Yeah, basically, if you're autogynephilic or autoandrophilic, it doesn't make you a bad person. It's fine to have this. It's just kind of a quirky kind of heterosexuality. It doesn't have to be a super big deal. And by understanding what it is and how it works, you can better understand yourself and also gain more control over how your gender journey, so to speak, plays out over your life. Because through understanding, your predictions will come true more often.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
If people want to get a hold of you, is that okay? Or
Yeah.
can
People
they,
can
yeah?
they can email me at autogynephilic@gmail.com. They can read my work at autoheterosexual.com. I'm also on Reddit and Ask AGP or our Autogynephilia. I'm a moderator on both of those.
Okay.
I'm on Twitter at Autogynephil. There's plenty of places that they can contact me, and if they're autogynephilic or autoandrophilic, I'm perfectly fine with them doing so. Awesome.
Thanks so much, Phil, for the very interesting and intriguing conversation. Thanks for being a guest on the show.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
This show is part of the Converge Podcast Network.